Welcome to TFR Let's Talk. I'm your host, Sapna Bhartiya, and my guest is once again Greg Kroah-Hartman, who needs no introduction, so I will not even bother with that. Greg, it's great to have you back. We have not seen each other in person, so I missed that interaction, but thanks for joining me today to talk about, I think, 30th anniversary of Linux kernel.
Yeah, I think it's 30th just by the virtue of all the reporter questions that keep getting sent to me over the past month.
How do you see this whole projects or movement you folks started there?
It's crazy. It's crazy that at one point it's like, oh, I remember that code. I did that. Oh, wow, I did that 20 years ago. And you're like, oh, wow, I really need to fix that up. A funny thing I was talking on another meeting with the Rust developers who are doing Rust for Linux. And I was like, oh, this old interface, we really want to fix it up. And I went back and looked at my old notes and I put it on my to-do list from 17 years ago that I wanted to fix something up. And it's never actually risen to the top of my list. So it's, at one point, it's like we still have the same problems that we did 20, 25 years ago. Another point, it's, wow, we've accomplished so much by not worrying about those things and worrying about what people are sending us and doing at the same time. It's just crazy that everybody's using it. I'm really happy. This is amazing that I can keep doing this for so long.
One thing that I feel, and I may be totally wrong, is that the way Linux changed the open source space was that I think it made corporate users comfortable with open source. Earlier, they were kind of worried about open source or free as in free software, which was more about sometimes ideology than the code itself. So if I ask you, how have you seen, because you also work with a lot of vendors, especially, for a lot of countries, helping them, embrace Linux and have the kernel. How have you seen that Linux made corporate users more comfortable? Because that also contributes heavily towards the sustainability of the project.
Oh, totally. I mean, even from the very beginning, we were all getting paid for this. Not all, but the huge majority. I did a keynote, 17, 18 years ago, tracking who works for what, and the top 80% of people were getting paid for it, because the joke then was you do 5 changes and you get a job, and that's still true, because corporations rely on this and require this, and they need this tool. And it's cheaper for them to hire you to work on the project than it is for them to create their own operating system. IBM, I'll call IBM out. They put a lot of money and backing into Linux because they realized with the license and the community, it was something that was put everybody on a level playing field. If IBM contributed to it, any company contributed to it, they got it back because they got to see the changes back from everybody else. The license required that. It made everybody equal, which is great. And it was cheaper for them. IBM, a long, long time ago, said, hey, it's cheaper for us to put a little bit of effort on this project or the things that we care about, and we get so much more back, and it's so much better. I remember sitting in a meeting, the funny thing was, because IBM wanted to sell hardware, and they're like, oh, we're trying to sell this specific type of hardware to this company, and it's like, what if you want to use a different bit of hardware? We're like, fine, Linux runs on that as well. And they're like, oh, well, you're right, it does. So that's great. And it's true. Linux is a nice abstraction layer that it lets you pick any type of hardware that you want. So over the years, we'd be able to move to ARM, Z series, RISC-V, all this stuff, and the same code base works on everything. And that's the key. It's the amazing success of what we've been able to do is because we run on anything. And Andrew Morton years and years ago said the first task of any processor company is to bring up Linux or a Linux emulation layer on that processor, and then they're okay. And that's pretty much true, and that's what's happened. So yeah, corporations are huge. Corporations, the funny thing is, everybody's mad about corporations, but everybody contributes to Linux, I say this all the time, in a very selfish way. You want to solve your problem, but it turns out your problem is the same problem everybody else's has. And if you contribute a little bit and work with everybody else to solve the same problem, it's cheaper, and it's faster, and it works for everybody. And that's all you want to do is solve your problem so you can do your real job. An operating system is a commodity. We've commoditized it at zero price. Build your applications and your usage models on top of that, and contribute to Linux where you need it, and it provides a solution for what you need. Look, we're in cow milking machines. We're in mega super yacht stabilizers. Like 15 years ago we were that. We're in the space station now. All these people who are in space, all the SpaceX stuff, all these companies contribute tiny little changes that they need for their specific usage model, and then they get the benefit of everything back. It's a wonderful corporate model. From a pure business point of view, it makes so much sense. So it's a really easy sell. It's a very easy sell to companies, yeah.
How did you manage to keep this project running like that, dodging all the political bullets?
Well, the easiest thing is we focus only on the technical solution in front of us. So Linus is very good at this, and I hope I am, and other core people are. You come to us with a solution for something that you've done, code. We very, very rarely talk about abstract ideas. If somebody has an idea of, oh, I want to go do this, it's like, wonderful, go code it up, and then come back to us, because that rules out whether it's even possible or not, right? That person finds it, and then we figure out, and we work from there. And that's removes a huge barrier of politics or ideas of this versus that, because when you have a working implementation, then you have something to work off of, right? A basics on what to do. And the the kernel community is what now? 4,000 developers, 550 people. We don't agree on anything. Politics, nothing else. All we agree on is we want to work on this technology, we want to work together, and this happens to be the license of the code that we work on. That's it. Now we have other interpretations of the license. We argued about GPL version 3. We have other things like that, but this is the specifics about what we want to work on. And we go from there, and we focus on that. I mean, there are lots of different political views within the kernel community, but we're all a big mass of different people, and that's good. We want different viewpoints of different things, but from a technology point of view, and we want to work together, and we want to contribute together, and we want to work with everybody. So that's a very way we can ignore a lot of stuff, and let's just focus on the technology of what you're proposing, and we can go from there. And that's one way we've succeeded.
And when you mentioned GPL, that was less of a political, that was purely technical, that what you can or cannot do with the code when you put in your device. So that also, I look at it, a technical disagreement over certain things.
Yeah. I mean, it's an agreement of, Linus has said it, I've said it. We want the GPL version 2 there so we can see your changes back. Whether we accept them or not is up to the community or the project, but that's all we want. We want to see the code back. We don't worry about the runtime thing. We don't worry about like the TiVoization craziness. That is not part of GPL version 2. We just want the code back so we can contribute, make the project better, and continue on. And that's the majority of us. There are some people within our community that disagree, but they also still contribute under GPL version 2, which is fine. We're allowed to disagree about that, but let's contribute and focus on the technical point of view. One other interesting thing is the way we've succeeded, and I remember I've talked to some of the BSD developers, we don't let people say, no, this part of the code base is mine, nobody else can touch it. Everybody can touch everything. And that's very successful. I remember one of the BSD developers told me once, they're like, oh, no, don't make those changes over that part of the BSD kernel, they said, because I'm going to work on that in the future. And so the person who was wanting to contribute goes away. And they don't get time around to do it and whatnot. We don't do that. Anybody can pretty much touch anything, and that's good, and that's successful that way. Because if anybody can touch anything, then you come to a working solution, and then it's really hard for me as a developer to say, oh, look, you spent all this time, or as a maintainer, you spent all this time working on this project, and the solution, now I have to say, no, don't do that work at all, because you've already done it. It's great. And we work from that and go from there. There is the old way of getting a maintainer to do some work you can do about once a year, is you contribute code that's written so badly, but yet still solves your problem, that you get the maintainer go, no, okay, well, I can't reject this because it does it the right way, but I'll do it the right way for you. And you go from there. But yes, that's one way that we have succeeded over other projects, is we don't partition and forbid other people from working on it. That's good. And anybody can be routed around. It works well.
Right. But even if, despite your good intentions, sometime, the recent case for the University of Minnesota.
I was waiting for that.
And I had a long IRON show with Dirk, and we talked about hostile, like not toxic people sometimes in the open source community and other things. So sometimes you do get caught in things like that. And looking at the size of kernel community and its user base, how do you also kind of ensure, I will not use that term bad actors, but how do you also, you have to keep a check on them also, because people will continue to try to either inject their code. I mean, we have seen a story about NSA, though actually NSA is doing a lot of great things also to secure a lot of things. But if I ask you, and I don't want to get into this university story, but I'm just asking you from your perspective, because you maintain a branch there, you have to stay vigilant as well.
Well, so the university thing raises a bunch of interesting questions, but the most interesting thing is we want our tools to catch bugs from any developer, be it me versus other maintainers versus a first-time person coming in. Because if you look at who's written the most bugs and contributed the most bugs, it's our most prolific developers. I've probably written more security holes than anybody else, accidentally. We want our tools to catch everybody. So it isn't a matter of trust of that. But we do have bad actors. I mean, we have kicked people out of our community for acting badly. The University of Minnesota was one of them. We've done this in the past with other individuals as well. When they start wasting they start wasting time of our users or start hurting and providing bad answers to people who are asking questions, then we will say, no, stop, you need to get out of this. That university was starting to waste time of maintainers on purpose, and that's also, no, you can't do that. If we maintainers, we need to have as much resources as possible for that. Don't waste their time on purpose. That's not allowed. So that's one reason that. But I mean, to be as far as vigilant and things like that, our trust model in the kernel, I've said this before, our trust model isn't that I trust that you got it right. I trust that you'll be around to fix it when you get it wrong, because everybody gets it wrong. So it's like some people I trust implicitly, I'll just take their code because I know they'll be there to fix it when it goes wrong, because I know they're a good developer and I know that's the trust model that we have. So we're not necessarily trusting that we're gonna get it right all the time, because we're human. We rely on our tooling, we're relying on testing, we're relying on other people reviewing to catch that. And that's our model of trust that we have. And it seems to work so well. And of course, we can always use more testing. We can always use more tooling. And we're getting more. We're getting a lot more stuff all the time, every day. We get lots of more tools. And like why I moved to Paris in the first place, there's really tools by Julia Lowell and her group that do more security bug finding than anybody else. Because once you find a pattern that's bad, you add it to these rules, and then that prevents it from ever coming back in future code, because they write the patterns and the tools will catch it, right? And that's what we want. We want those tooling and we want that stuff to happen. And that's the trust model we have. And we have to go with. So yeah, so we're not looking for explicit bad actors, because we're all human. We can all be doing wrong things at times.
And you folks are still doing all the work on mailing lists, right?
Oh yeah, email works really, really well. I mean, it's a nice universal way. It scales for any language and any way around the world, and it's the lowest common denominator. And it works really well because human interaction. If English is not your first language, it's very difficult. You don't have to communicate through a meeting. You don't have to communicate over IRC. It's a very good way to do technical interaction and review. I mean, we have yet to find a better tool that does this.
Yeah, no, that's why the Linux has kind of breaking so many kind of barriers in that way. So the question, the reason I mentioned mailing list quickly was that when you're talking about you trust, so do you trust people? As you mentioned, I trust that guy that they will fix the code, not that the person in general. But do you trust people more, or you have some processes in place also? So irrespective of who is in charge, you have processes in place that it will be taken care of. Also, if you want to go on vacation, you don't want to just, of course, even you folks, even when you're on vacation, you are checking your mails and then just sending patches.
Yeah, but we have process, like maintainers need to have a co-maintainer and to help them out with that. So like with stable kernel, I have Sasha Levin, who's helping me with that. So I can go on vacation, he can go on vacation, we can work on that. So that's trading off. That's human processes and types of this type of stuff in order to help us make a scale, help us survive in the long run and things like that. We have that. But a lot of stuff, we have some really good tooling going on so that you can authenticate. Now we can verify, if I send out a patch on the mailing list and I want to apply it, we can prove that it really was me that sent the patch. We have the tools to do that and apply it. We can check that. And a lot of developers are starting to use that. We have a big ring of trust that the kernel developers, the core people have as far as GPG. Anybody else can verify that a patch was sent out that really was sent out by me. We have that verification through mailing lists. It's all, the tooling's there, it's getting better. We're funding some developers to work on some projects with that. But we have that implicit trust and explicit trust is happening right now. And we just had our developer, our release process, how we do releases of the kernel was audited by a security group. And they said, here's some minor things that you guys might want to change, but the way you do releases and the way you do the security of how you do development is really good. So we've had a third party audit us already, and they published a report, which was nice to see.
What role do you see Linux Foundation has in a way played? Because what I see there, foundations, a lot of companies who never work together, they come together, and then they are different foundations, and they have never worked together, they collaborate. So the reason I am asking you is that when we look at open source, sometimes they get controlled by a company, sometimes it's run by an individual. But if you put in a neutral organization, and this time we are not talking in general about Linux Foundation, does that also play a role in popularity of this kind of open source project? Or you're like, no, it could be just a fluke, or it could be totally up to the project?
Well, projects, when they get to a certain size, need an organization from a legal standpoint for companies to be able to contribute to. I mean, it's illegal for competitors to talk amongst themselves in a non-public manner. It's antitrust violations in the US, there's other EU rules. It's illegal to do that. So they have to, so things like the trade organizations like the Linux Foundation or other types of nonprofit organizations, in order for companies to wish to contribute to a project together and help guide it, providing money, providing resources, they have to do so in using a foundation-like organization from a legal point of view. That's what they have to do. So projects that don't have a foundation or whatnot, either they were doing really well, like the kernel, we were doing really well. We don't rely on the Linux Foundation for our funding model at all. They happen to fund 3 or 4 of us, which is wonderful now. I resisted for many years to be hired by them, but now I am, because I think they're doing good work. The Linux Foundation for the kernel provides legal resources, and they provide very good marketing resources, which are things that developers traditionally don't do well, right? Before we had the Linux Foundation, we did not have good marketing, and I will point out the Linux Foundation has done a wonderful job. The marketing people there over the years, Amanda Brock, Jennifer Kroah, and other people over the years have done a wonderful job running conferences for us. Developers don't want to run conferences. They do a great job of that kind of stuff. And that's good. And that's what we need as far as a project in order to succeed has to have these external things besides just developers, right? And if they can fund developers too, that's wonderful. Linux Foundation provides a hosting environment, so does the Eclipse Foundation, so does SFLC, other organizations that can provide a way that corporations can come together, fund a project in a legal manner that helps the project succeed. You want to have that. It's just almost a requirement in order to do that. In the early days, we never needed that because companies allowed us to work on that stuff on their own, but then who did the marketing? Nobody did the marketing, and we were at the whim and of the wind, basically. It was horrible. So now people realize that this is what you need to do. So I'm happy. The Linux Foundation does a great job. They spin up a new organization every week about different projects. Kernel CI is a nice example of kernel testing. Is a project under Linux Foundation, so there's companies that provide the funding that can help get the back-end servers running for kernel CI for our testing. We need that, right? The way the companies can donate money to have that back-end testing. Wonderful. And then they don't pay for the development themselves, but the member companies help guide the development of that project. And that's the way they work. And it's a very successful model so far. It ebbs and flows as it comes and goes. But I think it's really important for a project to have this, to show that they're independent of any one corporation that happens to run it. Now, there are a number of software projects, open source projects, that are just run by one corporation, and then they provide a dual license deal with a closed source versus open source version. And that's a different model. And that if they want to continue doing that, wonderful. That's up to their project. I don't think that's the best model. I think you have lots of different companies using your product that shows that they all want it to succeed and rely on it, and that makes the project better over time.
Yeah, and there is always, since one company controls the code, and we have seen so many cases recently also that company will suddenly change either the license or they'll change the overall project. And when you change you don't just affect the user because that project has a lot of contributors. A lot of people start using in their product and service. Suddenly you disrupt the whole market. So that's kind of people lose trust in such projects.
Yeah, you don't want. Anybody that the kernel is. And from the very beginning, we've not allowed copyright assignments, right? The GNU project famously does. I think that makes companies feel very much better because now they're still in control over their copyright. There are downsides in that, what happens when companies disappear and copyright ownership there. But I think that outweighs the assigning all copyright to a third entity by far. It makes it equal. Everybody's on an equal playing field this way. If you assign copyright to somebody else, you are giving something up that you're not getting back. And I don't think that's a good way to run a project. The projects I use don't run that, don't use that model, but other software projects do, and they think that's a valid thing to do. That's wonderful for them. Again, different views of different things. Whatever works for your project is fine.
Do you feel that there is still a lot of awareness about open source doesn't simply mean just taking the code, but you should also get involved with it? Do you think companies are well educated about it, or you still have to go out and tell them, hey, you have to be a good citizen as well and give things back?
It has gotten easier, right? It is not so much difficult as it used to be. Again, marketing has played a huge role in that. The success of Linux, it's a snowball, it succeeds over that. I still do have to talk to companies and show them that it is cheaper for them to succeed by contributing upstream and contributing to the project. It takes some time for people to do that. It takes time educating companies that, you should take the stable kernel releases because it contains all the fixes that you could possibly want, and then some extra ones. and it's been tested. Don't just try and cherry pick. I have some education on some processes around that with companies, but that's good. These are good conversations to be having, and because they're using and relying on Linux in the first place. But yes, it's easier. We're continuing to grow, but I'm still have the same type of conversations at times with companies. But that's fine. And if you look, I've succeeded. Look at we've seen like the SOC maintainers are now actively contributing upstream. Well, 10 years ago they weren't at all. They were just dropping random tarballs at their customers and running away. And now customers are saying, no, we need these updated, we need these upstream, we need this requirement. And then that's just a model of, we saw 20 years ago with the carrier grade companies. That was the same idea that they had. So it's like we go through each industry that Linux succeeds in and I don't want to say takes over, but does well, and we end up doing the same education of the same companies over and over. Automotive is the same way. 10 years ago, I was talking to the automotive companies about this type, and they're like, why would we do open source? Isn't that insecure? It's like, okay, start over and talk about that. And now automotive, all cars run Linux. It's crazy. All their backends run Linux. And so it's just not even an issue there. But again, every company, every industry that we go through has the same issues as far as that goes. I think we're kind of running out of industries to take over.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. Next question. Yeah, is there anything left to be, or world domination is already achieved? And I think now you folks are also on Mars and other planets as well, the kernel.
Yes, we're in the helicopters on Mars, which is awesome. International Space Station's been running Linux for a while. All the satellites are running Linux. Rockets are all running Linux. I don't know about our industry. Medical industry is taking a while. It's slow. The defense industry, I've been getting some interesting queries about that, about companies, but they're using older kernels. So the defense industry is going to be interesting to see working with governments because they're old procurement processes that take decades. And working with that, how do you keep software up to date with a decade-long development model? They're having to roll in. You see US government now is requiring that all software be updatable and be kept up to date all the time. That's a requirement from the US government. So how is that going to apply to systems that traditionally have never been updated once they're made, right? Old airplanes, old everything. So seeing those models in that industry, so I think the defense industry, while it's been using Linux for a long period of time, while getting it to be a better participant and being more up to date is going to be one of the interesting things that we're going to see over time. But not sure from the US defense, all the other governments. In Europe, I've talked to other national agencies of different, they use Linux everywhere. France uses Linux all through the government everywhere. Netherlands, all these countries use Linux everywhere. So getting them up to date and remaining up to date and participating well is the key, is the next major step. The EU has had a big mandate to try and participate and support open source involvement, which is great. They're funding a lot of good projects. They're actually funding the developer to track all the kernel regressions, make sure we keep them up to date. He has a contract for, I think, 1 or 2 years, which is awesome. So that comes from an EU grant. Wonderful. So this is governments are realizing that this is something that they need to participate and support in order to succeed well. And again, it's cheaper for them to do that.
Right. Since you did bring up, and of course, Europe, they do a lot of work there. Since you did bring federal government, I think Pentagon, they have something, especially for the containers, they have something called Iron Bank, and they also have Platform One. So where the repositories are fully tested and, all the things that you're mentioning. And then suddenly, second thing is that Biden's, the executive order about software bill of materials, where they want to know what is in there. So there are some positive steps in the right direction that are going on there.
Yeah, software bill of materials is amazing. You want to know actually what's in your device. Traditionally, you've just assumed it came from the previous person, but it's always been really, really deep, this chain. I will call out the Linux Foundation has been working on the software bill of materials and that for a very long time. Shane has been working on that for a long time, and they now have some good project. FSF, Free Software Foundation Europe, with the reuse project, allowing automatic identification, which ties into SPDX, which is how you label licenses. It's just all these different open source groups working together to solve this problem of determining what is in the software that you have and is it up to date and what is the version. And that's very, very important. Yes, I'm very happy to see that. Security people have been asking for that for decades now, and it's very nice to see. So I'm happy about that.
You already mentioned a couple of use cases about where Linux has been used. But if I ask you, when you look at it and you're like, hey, oh, wow, they're using it there also. So has there ever been cases that you did not even know they were using Linux, and then suddenly you realize that? I think it's easier to ask where they are not using Linux versus where they are using. But if I ask you if you can share some of the most exciting use cases, even from your perspective, that you're like, oh, wow, this is really cool.
So I bought a washing machine a number of years ago when I moved to France. Turns out it runs Linux. So my washing machine runs Linux. Now we gave it to our daughter when she moved off to university. But our washing machine runs Linux. It has a little front screen. You can update it over the wire, which I wouldn't recommend over wireless. But yeah, and I think actually my dishwasher now runs Linux as well. These are common household appliances. Like, why would you want to have a Linux in there? But then they want to talk to a network. They want to talk to sensors. They want to put a pretty screen on the thing. They want to be able to say, hey, it's time to buy some more materials, things like that. So you do need an operating system in there. My power, when I purchased a house, or no, really, really interesting. A long time ago, my mother bought a new air conditioning system for her house where you could control each room individually. Turned out her little touchpad screens in every room was running Linux. That was like 15 years ago. That was crazy. That was my first instance of like, wow, people are using this I've never heard of, and they're using it in ways that I never even thought of. And then I talked to some people making the power meters that attach to your house, and those were all running Linux. And that was just amazing. These are developers that are working for traditionally old, big, stodgy companies that you never imagined, and they're using Linux to solve their problems. But after that, yeah, I've heard Linux. I mean, Linux is in the giant windmills. It's in the power turbines and the steam turbines in the U.S. for all the power and all the dams, hydroelectric dams. It's everywhere, and there's a lot of interesting. You hear about it like every couple of weeks. I'll hear a new use model. So there's people keeping track of it all. But the cow milking machine, automatic cow milking machine, is one of my funnest. I say this a lot, but the mega super yachts, there's a stabilizer underneath them that keeps them tipping over. About 15, 17 years ago, we got a patch from a company. That was what they were doing, and they were getting Linux to run these little things because those were being embedded in the bottom of the ship, and they were never going to be touched again. And they keep billionaires from flipping over. So, but that's the use of Linux that's like you never would possibly imagine. Linux is used in F1 racing all over the time. That's crazy. But it's fun. But it's a tool. I mean, Linux is just a tool that other people can solve their problems with. And we don't. And the nice thing that we like doing, I like making the tool because other people make really imaginative, crazy things and go from there. And because Linux is free and it's open source and everybody can contribute and use it, we've been able to see much more crazy and wild and amazing tools out there, or solutions to things, and that's what I'm really happy to see happen. And that's what I think is the amazing part of Linux is just that it allows so many people to do so many different things and solve their problems, and that's fun. I like doing that, seeing that.
Right, and when you mentioned dishwasher, I'm pretty sure that my DeLonghi coffee maker also runs Linux. There used to be some comic also that sudo make coffee, and actually I think that these smart coffee maker of DeLonghi and all those, Jura.
As you mentioned, that's a really good question. There is my daughter got a new Jura machine and it does Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I wonder what's in there.
Yeah, because I was checking out
Zephyr. It might be Zephyr. Zephyr is a really cool operating system.
Yeah, Zephyr. I was checking on DeLonghi and I did see some threads where they mentioned ARM Linux there, so it could be, because if you need to talk to Wi-Fi and you're connected to the internet through an app, you have to have a stack. It could be Zephyr or it could be Linux in most cases.
Oh yeah, so no, the higher end ones, the automatic coffee machines that you see in restaurants, those do run Linux. I don't know if they're running by Jira, but you're right. I have seen a post by some people like that. They were running the frame buffer on the front, so you can run a web browser on there just for fun. But yeah, those are all running Linux. Those are because they do want to talk back. And then, just the touch screens for the restaurant, the cash register, those are running Linux. So things like that. But it's a downside too. So you got to look at, all the air conditioning and HVAC units are running Linux. They've been running Linux for a long time. But if you look at the Target hack about 5-6 years ago, it got in through an unsecured HVAC machine. So you still need to require security on those types of machines. We've talked to, so there are Linux machines running in HVACs, and there's one company uses a really old 32-bit ARM processor, but they keep it up to date. They're always running. We're like, oh, can we drop this processor support? They're like, no, we're still doing it. We're running our latest stuff because we're keeping it up to date and they're making it secure. And that's great to see. We want to see that. So as long as somebody's still using this and using that processor and that hardware, we'll keep support running for it. And they're a great contributor back every couple of years or so. They'll pop in with some bug reports and say this needs to be updated. And that's great. And that's wonderful to see because they're making things secure. It's when people take really old versions of Linux and then never update them. That's the things that scare me. And that's your wireless router that came from your cable company. Things like that. Always run an updated firewall on the other side of that just to make sure. Insecure, unupdatable machines is our biggest worry now, and we're trying to make it easier and easier for the ecosystem to make sure that those are updated. Android's been working a lot. I mean, there's billions of Android devices out there. The number of Linux servers are a rounding error compared to the number of Android Linux machines out there, right? Keeping those up to date and secure is immensely important and a very, very much thing that Google has been working on for the past 5 years, that Chrome OS keeps it up to date. Android devices are now required to keep up to date. And that's a great thing to see happen. Now, hopefully other devices and other companies and other projects will keep that same idea up and make sure their devices are up to date. Yocto finally you can do updates with Yocto now, finally. So that's a good idea and a good model to see finally.
Yeah, that's the flip thing. As much excited as I am about these devices running, not just Linux, any other, like my Samsung TV, the last update it received was in February last year. And it's running Tizen. It has not seen any update, so I'm kind of worried that I don't know what version it's running, if it's secure or not. So when we talk about refrigerators, they last for 20 or 30 years. So it should be somewhere in the guarantee as well, or maybe it should come from the government that I should be getting software update for the life cycle of that project. Otherwise, it's connected to my network, and once as you gave our target, it could become a kind of Trojan horse into my. I can be running a fully secure network, but anything can come through my TV or fridge or coffee machine.
Yeah, and that's very important. So if you look at, there are companies that are getting it. I talked to one big, at the Linus Foundation Europe conference when it was in Lyon, one very big company that makes consumer electronics in Europe. They're like, we want to have Linux in these devices for 15 years. I was like, oh no, you don't want to use a 15-year-old kernel. Like, no. We consider these have to stay up to date, and we want to keep them up to date all the way till maybe the last year of the 15-year life cycle. Then we'll put it in maintenance mode because we want to make sure these are up to date and secure and responsive because that's what somebody's paying us for. They're paying for these devices to last that long. That's our guarantee to them, and we want to make sure we're up to date with that. And it was wonderful to see. This is a giant electronics manufacturer that's doing that. And I'm so happy to see that they're ahead of the curve of the mandate of the laws that are going to come into play. And if you see the U.S. government is now requiring this for a lot of devices, they have to be updatable and they have to be kept up to date. And that's the key. And enforcing that's going to be interesting to see how that happens. I think companies are realizing it's coming, so they're doing that work ahead of time. You have the flip side. You have like the CIP project from the Linux Foundation, which wants to keep some versions of the kernel around for 20 years. And their model is they're saying, okay, Linux is going to need streetlights. And these streetlights are partitioned off, and we know they're not affected the world except these certain ways. And there you might be able to argue that, okay, if you firewall it off enough and you know your usage model isn't going to change any, maybe you can handle that. I personally think that's wrong. I don't think that's the right model to use, but that's what their business and that's what they're going for. So, but that's cool. At least they're trying, right? And they're going to try and keep it up to date, and they're going to try and ensure that it's secure. So I'd much rather have them do that than to just ignore it, right? So it's going to be better than that. So we'll see. That's a little evolutionary model that we're trying to play with. That's going to be the next 5 years, 10 years. We're going to see how people are using Linux and making sure that these devices are kept up to date because it's becoming more and more important, as you say.
I mean, if you look at these 30 years, if there was something that you're like, hey, we should have done it differently, is there anything you would have done differently? Or if you get chance again, somebody send you back in time and you'll do everything just the same way?
Well, remember when I mentioned I had a to-do list and I had an item on there from 17 years ago? I was like, oh, I just got to carve out like 2 or 3 weeks to do this thing. I should have done it then. Instead of waiting till now. So always when you have these things, because you're like, oh, there's like 20 users of it in the kernel, I'm going to have to change them all to update it. Now there's like 200 users of it in the kernel, I have to change them all. Things like that. So I need to stop procrastinating on things. Oh, I know I have to do this type of thing, get it done. So I have a few of those. I wish I'd gone back in time and done. But to be fair, maybe I would have spent the time working on something else. I don't remember what I did at the time. So I would like to do that. I'm gonna, over the next couple of years, I have a list. I'm like, okay, I gotta carve out some time to work on this, work on this, work on this. And that's up to me individually as far as what I want to work on. But yeah, so if you have a list, prioritize it and try and carve out some time and work on it. It keeps you up to date. It makes you have more fun.
So if you had the opportunity to build a Linux-powered time machine, you will procrastinate because you don't even know what to go and fix it. So you won't even build the machine.
Yeah, that's true.
More or less like that. Awesome, Greg. Thank you so much for sharing these. When we reflect on these 30 years, it doesn't look like it's 30 years, though we all over there.
Yeah, we're all
here. You don't have any hair left, but so it does look like. But it still feel like it was just yesterday. So thanks for this awesome journey, and as usual, I look forward to talk to you again. Maybe in person we'll see, but. It's an incredible journey that we have. Linux has played a very big role in my career. I have become an open source journalist, and partially it's when 2006 when I met Jim Zemlin, Mark Shuttleworth, all those folks, and that changed my whole opinion. I used to be a science fiction writer, or science fiction or science. Patents are something which is holy. You don't share things, and it changed my whole outlook. So, in a way, you folks kind of built my career too. So, thanks for that as well.
We're all doing careers that we never had was around before. And then the other interesting, I will say this. So it's fun watching everybody work. The whole Corona thing that hit, everybody happened to, we got to work at home and remote teams. I was like, those of us on the kernel, this is awesome. We've been doing this for 15, 20 years. We know how to work remotely. We know this can be done. We have the tools in place to do this. And everybody's like, I guess you can work at home. You can work remotely. From a technical point of view, doing things like this is possible. And we're like, yeah, we told you so. But we're doing, and now the world is seeing these type of things happen that reinforces that our model happens to actually be a viable model for some problems. And we're creating jobs and opportunities that were never around. There was never, it's only very recently that I think my parents finally understand what I do. So as far as that goes, I'm working at home for 15, 20 years now. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that do understand, because my son, they think mommy works, daddy just sits at home, watches video and TV, and that's all he does. I don't work.
Well, famously, my son, years ago when he was in school, he's like, no, my dad doesn't have a job. He just sits at home in his pajamas doing email. He drew a little picture of that. So, yes. But now I take them out to conferences and they know what they're doing and things like that. So my daughter's spoken at conferences, my son's been to them, and it's fun like that.
So now your parents and your kids, they both understand what you do. That's a big achievement in 30 years.
Yes,
so
I'm very happy.
Finally.
Finally.
Awesome. Greg, thank you.
Thank you.